I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close-Up. Jules Feiffer, one of our national treasures, the multi-hyphenate playwright, screenwriter, illustrator, graphic novelist, has captured our times with a sharp brush and even sharper words. He joined us in a moment to discuss his latest novel, The Ghost Script. And although it's graphic, it's not a novel. Sports of the Times columnist Michael Powell brings us his perspective on the president's dispute with CNN's Don Lemon and super athlete and educator LeBron James, the subject of Michael's recent column. And I'll add some additional words on Coda. But first, Jules Feiffer. His latest graphic novel, The Ghost Script, the third and concluding in a series, has just been published by Live Right Publishing Corporation, the division of W.W. Norton and Company, ripped from the headlines from several eras and up to the minute. Kirkus Reviews said that Feiffer has delivered a madcap meditation on love, loyalty, identity, and America. Now, you said, Jules, that you went to hear Jerome Robbins testify down in Foley Square before the House Un-American Activities Committee, but this book was really inspired by Clifford Odets. Why so?
Well, I went to see a memorial service in Brooklyn for the group theater, one of the group theater founders and character actors in movies, J. Edward Bromberg, a rather famous second-level actor in movies for a number of years, character actor, and Bromberg was much beloved, and died of a heart attack after the blacklist. He could not find work, and was considered a victim of the blacklist, and a whole parade of notables, all of them blacklisted one way or another. One of them, Lee Grant, just beginning her career as a star performance in Detective Story, who had never done anything political before and was immediately blacklisted, and her career was over for a period of years. Extraordinary. But the surprise speaker at this talk was Clifford Odets, who anybody on the left considered sold out to Hollywood years ago, and he gave a passionate speech that seemed to be way out of the great days of Waiting for Lefty and Awaken Sing, pure Odetsian poetry and declamatory language, and he had the audience on its feet saying, "We will honor Joe. Joe will not lose. We will win. We will beat this back. We will beat these bastards." And, just absolutely glorious Odetsian prose. We were all screaming, "Odets is back, Odets is back." And no more than a week or so later, he appears as a friendly witness before the House Un-American Activities Committee. And when asked by the chairman who recruited him into the Communist Party, he said J. Edward Bromberg. And I thought, this is insanity. I mean, what world am I living in? What are the rules? There are no rules. This is pure madness. Who can you depend on? Is my mother my mother? Is my father my father? Is anybody, I think, I was in a state of consternation and confusion that has helped set the tone for really what followed for the rest of my life and the rest of my career, trying to figure out what the hell is going on. And as I say in the introduction to the book, this book is my last word on the subject, this graphic novel. But I wrote it with the passion that came out of those years in the 50s when I saw so many, long before I had any ambition to be a writer, certainly not to be a playwright. I was going to be a cartoonist, and that was it. But something about the idea of depriving people of their right to make a living because of their political views and their social views, and whether they're correctly or falsely accused of communists, it didn't matter. They were out of work, and it stayed with me to this day. That's why the book is dedicated to I.F. Stone, Murray Kempton, and Leonard Boudin, three heroes of mine and friends of mine who were vital during that period.
They certainly were. And the book, The Ghost List, is about a damning list in itself. A lot of people who we've had on the show, and I've asked this too, I've asked, how does this period, a period of electronic surveillance, of no privacy, of crackdowns on freedom of speech, how does this period compare to then? And some of them say, oh, it's much worse. Some of them say, how can you compare it to a time when people were killing themselves, when they were blacklisted? What do you think?
Well, the big difference in this period is we've somehow gotten around to electing Joe McCarthy president. And McCarthy never had that kind of power. And Eisenhower could bring him down as soon as he went against the army. That's the only reason McCarthy went down, because he went against Eisenhower, sitting this out until Shine and Cone went against the army, and that was the end of him. But so I think we are in many ways a more dangerous period. Although that was, that whole period, and my interest in this, because it was when I was a young man during it, was essentially post-McCarthy, because post-McCarthy, as you will remember, was just as dangerous. I mean, the period that I came of age with the Village Voice, and even before the Voice, was when young men and women of my generation were very and who went to good schools were nervous to share their opinions with people because they might get into trouble. And this is in the 1950s. Were very scared that they didn't want to injure their careers. They wanted to say the right things. They didn't want to sign petitions. They wanted to do any of that. And that became the bedrock of my early work at The Voice. I wanted to, in what I did that was political as opposed to the other stuff I was doing. I wanted to show what we had become and what we were becoming. But it's been of vital interest, and finally getting a chance to do a book on the blacklist, which helped form my sensibility in a major way, was irresistible in terms of flushing out this trilogy that was so unexpected on my part, and ended up being one of the major achievements of my life. I've loved doing it more than just about anything else.
One of the things you point out in the book, and maybe I should have known this, but I didn't, is that Roy Cohn was a distant cousin.
Cousin Roy, you didn't know?
Yes, I did not know that. Now, if he were sitting here, did you know him? Did you talk to him?
I knew him slightly as a kid. He was part of the rich part of the family, and they used to send the Cohn family used to send a limo down every once in a while to the Pfeiffers in the Bronx, in the poor part of the Bronx, not the concourse.
Not Riverdale, the concourse.
Not Riverdale, and it was what later became Bruckner Boulevard, wiped out by Mr. Moses. They'd send a car down, and I'd get Roy's hand-me-downs. I'd had a camp cup that said RMC on it, and little sweaters that with RMC on it, and I only got to see Roy in adulthood when I had the nerve to call him up and make an appointment, because I was writing a screenplay about a political fixer in New York politics. And all I wanted from him was some sense of what the conversation was like in the back room when you're talking about Supreme Court justices and who you're named to this. I didn't want any inside info. I just wanted the dialogue, how it went, how the conversation went.
And he would know.
And he would know. And of course, and he could not have been kinder. And then he gave me a lecture on, on absolutely nothing, and no help at all. And I had this cartoon balloon over my head saying, "It serves me right. He has every right to do this." And I was a schmuck to even, think he would do anything else. Other than that, he couldn't have been more friendly, and he was just absolute nonsense.
Didn't you want to wring his neck or ask him something a little bit more controversial, or not?
What was interesting, it was before the word on Roy was out completely. And you walk into his office, which was on the ground floor, and it was totally peopled by pretty young men. And there were toy. Were you ever there?
Yes, I was, on 68th Street.
The pandas and the bears, and I mean, all quite surprising, and more or less gave the game away.
We talked about the death of irony before, years ago. Do we now have, with everything going on in Washington and beyond, the death of satire? I mean, is it hard to be satirical in an age like this when real things are going on the way they are?
Well, I think there's some wonderful satire done now. Colbert Show does it. The occasional appearances of Jon Stewart, who's still a master. I mean, he's the most important voice we have of comedy before, and I think continuing when he starts to shoot his mouth off, it's really quite remarkable what he comes up with and what he does. But political cartoonists like my friend Jeff Danziger, who just syndicates his work, nobody does tougher, stronger, extraordinary stuff. I think all that does is help all of us feel better. It does nothing to overthrow the government, but nothing will overthrow this government because it's a government, because we no longer have a governing class. We have a slavering class. It's just goes along for the flow. All principle has disappeared from the Republican Party, and it's, I mean, and that's the real crisis, not the danger of Trump, but the triumph of Trumpism among his own party, and they will not do anything to diminish him. It will have to be Mr. Mueller and what follows, and then we'll see.
Well, as you said, McCarthy wasn't president. Trump is, if you want to make that comparison. But there sure was a lot of apathy in the 50s, too.
There was a lot of apathy, and the Republicans weren't doing much either until, but it was still, there was still a few people who did something, and now those people don't seem to exist at all. I mean, Trump is Trump, but his cohorts in his own party are a disgrace.
So do you think writers, cartoonists can still have impact? Who shapes public opinion now?
I think we help shape public opinion, but we know well that among Trump's voters, they don't read Feiffer, they don't read Danziger, they don't, they have their own broadcasters and their own networks and their own Facebooks and they have Fox News, and they don't know what's going on, this other stuff, and they don't want to know, and the digital revolution has invented its own closed off history. So that, and when I was a kid during the Great Depression, everybody belonged to the same culture, more or less. Everybody listened to Jack Benny across the country. Everybody listened to Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy across the country. Everybody went to see Fred Ginger and Westerns, and the culture had something in common, and musicals and crime movies, and we were a people joined really by the forms of entertainment that united us all. And now the forms of entertainment are a little something you look at in the box and you decide what you want.
By yourself.
By yourself. So that even when people go to theater with your shared experience, they will be looking at their, it's just.
Well, how do you recreate any sort of common experience, commonality, without being sappy about it? How do you make people listen to other people?
I think there's always a way to tell a story. And there's always a new way to tell a story or a fresh way to tell a story. And what I was trying to do in these 3 books was to tell a story as it came to me, because much of it, I didn't know where the book was going when I started it. And that I should end this way, came as much of a surprise to me. I mean, I found over the years, as a writer and a cartoonist, that from going to planning something out in the beginning and then writing according to my own notes, as I did with my first plays, Little Murders and Cardinal Knowledge, it became more fun to stop knowing. It became more interesting to become not just the creator of this, but a member of my own audience, surprised by what I was doing. And that's the way I work now. And it has turned out to be so much more fun and pleasure and exciting for me, because it's my sensibility. I know I'm going to end up in the place I want to end up, but the way I get there takes me down so many roads I had not expected to go down, and I'm full of surprises and full of the joy that the unexpected brings me. And it reminds me of the kind of improv that I early saw in Chicago at Second City, when they would start with an opening line and you never know where they were going, and they didn't know where they were going, and they got there. And that's what I've been doing. Improv, my own form of improv, as these storyboard screenplays on paper. It's great fun.
And thank you for the joy that you have brought the rest of us. The latest book, The Ghost Script by Jules Feiffer, Live Right Publishing Corporation, the imprint of W. Norton. Thanks for joining us. And coming up next, Sports of the Times columnist Michael Powell. Welcome back. Joining us now, Sports of the Times columnist Michael Powell. His recent columns have focused on President Trump and the president's attack on CNN's Don Lemon and basketball great LeBron James, among others. What is this all about? Why is the president picking on LeBron James?
You know, I think, this is a case of where subtext is text or text is subtext. He seems to be very comfortable going after black athletes. He did it around the national anthem last year. He did it in kind of explosive fashion, going down to Alabama before an all-white crowd, supporting an extremely conservative candidate, and went after the athletes at that point in kind of vitriolic terms, fire them and this sort of thing. And he went after, LeBron James, and frankly, an interview that was 97% a touching account of how he's helped to start this school in his hometown.
How LeBron James has.
Yes, how LeBron James has, I'm sorry. And it was, to me, breathtaking that the President of the United States would have watched that with, at the end of it, a glancing blow, frankly, at Trump, and taken away from it nothing but kind of personal pique and anger. And it is kind of striking. There's been a number of white NBA coaches who have criticized the president very eloquently and in no uncertain terms. He's not gone after them, but he's gone after LeBron James and around the question of his intelligence, talking about how he is essentially a dumb man. And I feel like you'd have to bend over backwards not to see a racial subtext there.
You point out that, of course, the president is not very tolerant of most people, regardless of their race. But then you ask the question, is this genuine annoyance or is it a political calculation? Do we know?
Well, of course, right. The nature of this is you never know for sure. But he's proven, it seems to me, with his policies in any number of areas, that he hews to and caters to his base with an intensity that few American presidents have ever shown. And that base is a white, middle class, working class base with a lot of resentment, a lot of nativism, and a lot of, put kindly, sort of undigested racial anger. And it just, again, what is striking, it's true he's going after the intelligence of some whites that he's criticized, but the vehemence and the way in which that is his first move on not just black athletes. He's gone after black politicians also on their IQ and how they're dumb. And for a man who claims to be so taken with his own intelligence, as the president is, it's kind of striking at the very best gloss, I guess I could put on it, is it's striking that he's that tone deaf, that he's that unaware of the history of the United States and the way in which whites, going back into the 19th century, if there is one trope, it is to question the intelligence, because it kind of justifies everything. Justification all flows from that, like a river does from the mountains. So, you go back to the 19th, early 20th century, they were measuring skulls and brain sizes of blacks in an effort to kind of show scientific racism. And, so this stuff resonates with blacks, and I would argue with his white base in a way that's pretty uncertain.
We probably have no way of measuring whether it's genuine or politically calculated. But what about the fact that it obviously resonates with his base, that he is so popular, that he got elected, and that so many people are still supporting him, even when he says things that used to not be acceptable.
Right, and what's a little bit, I think, disturbing is that it's maybe not even because he does that, but maybe it's because he does that. So in other words, maybe I get into this discussion, and in fact I did on email with some readers afterwards, white readers, who said, well, he's not racist, this isn't racial, this isn't. Now, I don't know if he's racist. I mean, it seems to me that it's race baiting of a sort is almost certain. But I do think that it's the inability, frankly, of a lot of white males, and I'm a lifelong white male, to put yourself even tangentially in the shoes of an African American, watching. I mean, this is, in LeBron James, frankly, one of the most intelligent athletes I've ever covered. I didn't say he's not Albert Einstein. Most of us are not, but he is a very bright, reflective, at times really quite introspective athlete. And he, more than most athletes, has, really tried to to break out of his athletic bubble and to speak to a larger existence. And doesn't mean you have to agree with him all the time, and go back and forth with him, sure. But to attack his intelligence again, it feels to me like I would have to bend over backwards to a state that would throw my back out to say that there isn't something that's racial there.
We've always been ambivalent about actors, celebrities speaking out on political issues. Are they capitalizing on their fame? Do they really know what they're talking about? What about athletes? I mean, are they any more qualified or any less qualified to speak about issues that, say, have nothing to do with sports?
Look, I think that's a great question, and the answer is, I guess, it depends on the athlete, right? Just as it depends on the actor. There was a rather low-grade actor who became a pretty high-grade president, right, for 8 years, Ronald Reagan. It's not, so I guess it's not a given. I mean, if I could certainly pick some basketball players and other athletes I'd cover who I would not want to hear speak out on much other than, whether they hit a three-point shot. But on the other hand, I think it's actually been quite moving to watch athletes, not just black, though many of them black, kind of embracing this larger place in the world. And as I say, it seems to me, look, it's perfectly fair game for the president to, pick an argument around an issue,
yeah.
Sure. And
he's entitled to.
Yeah, go at it. But I mean, what was he talking about? I mean, again, LeBron, what was he talking about? He was talking about starting a public school, right, with, at least 25% of which will be funded out of LeBron. He's talking about buying bicycles and the role that bicycles played in his life. And by the way, what was frankly kind of moving is he said, all of this, education and bikes, gave me the ability to meet kids of different colors, specifically white kids. And that I befriended them, they befriended me, and through that you start to understand each other's world.
What more could you ask for?
Right. So again, if you're the president and you're watching that, I'm trying to think how you take out of this an attack on the man's intelligence.
Thanks to Michael Powell for joining us. You could read his Sports of the Times columns in print and, of course, at nytimes.com. And I'll add some additional thoughts on Coda. There's good news tonight, was how Gabriel Heater began his radio broadcasts. His program aired during the Depression and World War II, which made that prequel all the more difficult to redeem. The good news this week is that the stage version of Paddy Chayefsky's award-winning film Network is coming to Broadway. The satire about a fictional television news program struggling with its ratings was directed by Sidney Lumet. It starred Faye Dunaway, Peter Finch, William Holden, and Robert Duvall. Vincent Canby wrote in the Times that Network captured, quote, the satirist's cardiogram of the hidden heart, not just of television, but also of the society that supports it, and is in turn supported. Years later, the screenwriter Aaron Sorkin was quoted in the Times as saying, "No predictor of the future, not even George Orwell, has ever been as right as Chayefsky was when he wrote Network." At first blush, Network on Broadway might seem like a long shot. How could any remake beat the original? Decide for yourself, but earlier this year in London, I saw the version that's coming to Broadway. It stars Bryan Cranston, and it was breathtaking. A theatrical adaptation from a distant era faces another hurdle. The screenplay was written more than 40 years ago, plenty of time to become an anachronism, except that it isn't. 1976 was barely post-Vietnam and Watergate. In an area of fake news, press bashing, bottled-up rage, and false gods, Network may be more relevant than ever. The American people want something to articulate their rage for them, a cynical programming executive says in the 1976 film. The somebody who emerges to do just that was Peter Finch's Howard Beale, the network anchorman. Just before a cat food commercial, he casually announces on the nightly news that he'll kill himself on camera the next Tuesday. When the network nervously lets him return the following night to explain, he tells his viewers, "Every night, I've been sitting behind that desk, the dispassionate pundit, reporting with seemly detachment the daily parade of lunacies that constitute the news. And just once, I wanted to say what I really felt." Then he urges his viewers to act out too, not to get angry, but to get mad. Things have got to change, but you can't change them unless you get mad, he declares. And he exhorts them to shout what becomes the movie's punchline: "I'm mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore." After 40 years, are you? For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.